the sake of this short discussion, let's just take a simple and straightforward definition of supererogation as our starting point. Let's define supererogation as a moral action that has a higher level of moral merit or moral praiseworthiness than the minimum moral obligation. That minimum obligation, let's call a moral duty. And there are many ways to define that minimum obligation, but let's just take one example. So let's set the normative standard of not doing harm to another human being as the baseline for the minimum moral obligation. For example, in this case, the minimum moral obligation would be to not push someone off of this balcony and hence cause harm, right? But on the other hand, it is not your minimum moral obligation to stop someone from falling off this balcony. So as you can see, that's one common way to define the standard for the minimum moral obligation in a negative way. For example, in the sense of not harming someone. During this global pandemic, we often hear a lot of narratives in the media about supererogatory actions, or in their extreme forms, heroic and even saintly actions. For example, we have medical frontliners who are going beyond the call of duty, so to speak, right? In saving the lives of people afflicted by the disease, to the extent that they might contract the disease and in some cases even die from it in the process. Also, for instance, we see people who do a lot of charity work to help out those who are suffering during this pandemic. Connecting that to our notion of supererogation that we talked earlier, we can say that these people are executing supererogatory moral actions because they are going beyond the call of moral duty, which, as we simply defined earlier, is not doing harm to another human being. We might think of that normative baseline of what a minimum moral obligation would be as the negative or liberal baseline that puts primacy on the individual right? So meaning individual liberty is the most important ideal, and someone can exercise his or her own individual liberty as long as that person is not hurting any other human being. But we might raise the question, is that the right normative baseline for a minimum moral obligation? At this point, we might invoke the notion of justice, which is, in its basic sense, concerned with how we are related to other people as human beings. It's the basic idea that what we should care about is not only our own well-being or our own individual liberty. There is a reason to believe that we might also need to care about the well-being of other people, or how fair that relational well-being is relative to us, or how just that is, beyond just the minimal idea of not harming them. When we come to think of it, the normative idea of the minimum moral obligation being the state wherein you are not harming someone is already problematic, because it invokes a notion of a baseline, a normal, a status quo that is already very particular. Here, we would mention the notion of objective violence, right? Because violence, again, is an idea that's very much related to harm, right? So if you render violence to someone, conceivably you are also harming that person. Objective violence basically means violence that is already underlying the status quo of things, right? So if subjective violence is a subject, for example, myself, inflicting a violent act on someone that is highly visible and is seen as a disturbance to the normal order of things, the idea of objective violence is precisely the invisible violence that is precisely needed to keep the normal state of affairs. So here, more concretely, these are the underlying injustices that are already inherent to the system as such. And so in this view, it might be the case that you are claiming that you are not harming someone, but precisely because you have objective violence that underlies the system, not harming someone is still a state of injustice against the marginalized. This objective violence becomes more pronounced in the current global pandemic. We see the previously marginalized who were already being oppressed in the old normal. In the current situation, they are suffering even more. And the privilege of the few who have been blessed, even in the old normal, are also being more obvious. So this begs the question, what kind of minimum moral obligation then is called upon in this global pandemic situation? And correspondingly, what actions can be counted as supererogatory in the current times? There is certainly no question that the actions that are being done by medical frontliners, for example, are supererogatory. I would say even that rightfully we call them heroic, even saintly, right? So they are giving their very most fundamental individual liberty, which is their right to life, for the sake of helping others. But beyond that narrative of subjective supererogation, the more important question, I think, is what sort of supererogatory action needs to be more prevalent in a situation wherein objective violence become more pronounced and more people are being pushed to the margins and suffer on account of a few privileged people. In closing, perhaps the right way to think about supererogatory ethics during a pandemic is to ponder on the question of what sort of supererogatory actions are demanded by the current times, or any time for that matter. Perhaps we should go beyond the notion of just subjective or individual actions of supererogation and also think about the broader socio-economic and political inequalities and injustices around us. Perhaps we should think about how limited our common notions are of the minimum moral obligation that each of us has to carry. Perhaps we should go beyond just our individual rights, liberties, and welfare and go beyond just the notion of I'm a morally worthy being as long as I don't harm someone else. And also ponder on whether that very notion of harm is already problematic and is already anchored on a built-in injustice. Perhaps the real supererogation that we need, especially during the pandemic, and which the pandemic renders more palpable, is the supererogation that challenges the system that oppresses many for the privileged few.